Thank you, Presiding Officer. When Humza Yousaf was standing to be leader of his party, he promised to meet and better Scotland's climate targets. And when Rishi Sunak rolled back on the UK's climate commitments, the First Minister said that he had no intention to change the target dates. This is what he had to say about Rishi Sunak. The UK Government's actions in the face of that climate catastrophe are simply unforgivable. What the UK Government are saying is that we can roll back on our commitments, and it is the planet, it is people that will suffer the effects. And now, today, this SNP Green Government is going to roll back on its climate commitments. So why is Humza Yousaf following the Tories' lead?
First Minister.
Untrue. And it's probably, Presiding Officer, why it's wise to actually listen to the detail of a parliamentary statement before, of course, simply coming forward with misleading and mischaracterisation of our position. What I would say,
Let's hear the First Minister.
Is, as the Parliament will hear later this afternoon, there is no intention to roll back from that 2045 date in order for us to reach net zero. In order for us to reach net zero, of course, 5 years ahead of the UK Government, in order for us to continue to have more ambitious climate change targets than Labour-run Wales, for example. And, Presiding Officer, we, of course, have made progress. Between 1990 and 2021, we've reduced our carbon emissions faster than any other nation in the UK. But let me also be clear, this Government will not move back by, as I say, a single month, a week or even a day from that 2045 target to achieving net zero. But let's be clear, the Climate Change Committee were always clear with us that the 2030 target was a stretch target. That was clear to all of us when we all committed, when we all backed that target in the first place. But what doesn't change and what won't change is that end destination of 2045. So what I will say is that the Cabinet Secretary will come forward to this chamber with details of an accelerated package of climate action. Now, what we've had, of course, from the opposition time and time again, from Anas Sarwar and his party, is, of course, opposition to every single measure that we have brought forward. So if he and other members of the opposition are serious on tackling the climate crisis,
let's hear the First Minister.
It's time for them not to shy away, not to run away, but to back the ambitious climate action that we will bring forward, Presiding Officer.
Anas Sarwar.
Presiding Officer, we voted for your targets, and by the way, and that was such an embarrassing response. I mean, that embarrassing argument might have worked with Patrick Harvey and Lorna Slater. It's not working with the Scottish people. So let's be clear. Chris Stark of the Climate Change Committee said last month that the government's carbon reduction targets were no longer credible. And he has been clear that in many areas the Scottish Government has all the powers they need to make the difference, but they have not taken action. And the response from across Scotland to the SNP and Greens rolling back on their climate commitments has been rightly scathing. Oxfam Scotland have said this morning it's an acute global embarrassment. Friends of the Earth said it's the worst environmental decision in the history of the Scottish Parliament. Even one of his own ministers last night described it as very disappointing. And now, Presiding Officer, we must have the only Green Party in the world that supports scrapping a climate change target. Isn't this why more and more people across Scotland are asking what is the point of this SNP Green Government?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, Anas Sarwar started his second question by saying that the Labour Party backed the targets. That's not in dispute. The point is, every time we brought action to this chamber, he has opposed it time and time again. And Anas Sarwar sits there and shakes his head. Well, when we brought forward a transport bill that had a workplace parking levy, of course, Labour tried to remove the workplace parking levy. Not only that, of course, their own transport spokesperson called it, and I quote, highway robbery. He called it a car park tax. That was despite the fact, of course, that a Labour-run council in England had already brought forward a workplace parking
Let's hear the
levy.
First Minister.
So under this government, we have, of course, made progress. Whether it's, of course, the fact that when it comes to electricity generation, 87.9% comes from zero or low-carbon sources, whether that's the fact that 75% of all new woodland creation throughout the UK is here in Scotland, whether it's the success of the offshore wind leasing round, ScotWind, with us ensuring we have one of the most generous concessionary travel schemes in the UK, the £65 million we put towards 2,700 EV charging points. And when Mairi McAllan comes to this chamber in the afternoon, we will build upon that by bringing forward an accelerated climate change proposal and plan. What is important here, Presiding Officer, is for those that demand action, that they then unequivocally support that bold and radical action. Failure to do so will be nothing other than hypocrisy, Presiding Officer.
Anas Sarwar.
Only Humza Yousaf could believe slamming the brakes is an acceleration, because that's what they're doing this afternoon. And we already know Humza Yousaf supports a tax on workers, but doesn't support a tax on the oil and gas giants who are making record profits. Because the fact is, Humza Yousaf is rowing back on his climate targets, and the Green Party is backing him up. This SNP Green government's failures mean higher bills, fewer green jobs, and other countries winning the global race for clean energy. But while they fail to meet their promises on jobs, Labour will deliver over 50,000 clean power jobs in Scotland. While they cut the money on retrofitting homes, Labour will upgrade thousands of homes to make them more energy efficient. And while they sell off Scotland's seabed on the cheap, Labour will deliver a publicly owned energy generation company headquartered here in Scotland. Presiding Officer, we all know Scotland has huge potential, and the people of Scotland gave the SNP a huge opportunity, which they have wasted. Isn't it any wonder that people across the country believe that the SNP has lost its way, it has the wrong priorities, and is letting people down every single day?
First Minister.
In that very short list of actions that Labour will be taking, there was one policy that was absent, of course. That was the £28 billion that they pledged for the Green Prosperity Fund. That was the £28 billion that you pledged. So instead of £28 billion, we get a brass plaque that will undoubtedly match the brass neck that Labour have, Presiding Officer. Let me state the facts. Let's cut through the sound bites and the lack of substance from Anas Sarwar. Let's stick to the facts. Scotland has reduced carbon emissions faster than any other part of the UK. That's a fact. We're absolutely committed. No rolling back on the net zero by 2045 target. Fact. The equivalent of 113% of Scotland's overall electricity consumption in 2022 was generated by renewables. That's a fact. 75% of all woodlands creation throughout the UK is in Scotland. Fact. The only green policy, of course, Labour had was the £28 billion a year Green Prosperity Fund that they have dumped. And, of course, they take pride in the fact that they're risking, their reckless plans are risking, we know, up to tens of thousands of jobs in the North East, all to fund new nuclear power stations in England. So this afternoon, Presiding Officer, will be a key test when the Cabinet Secretary brings forward an accelerated package of climate proposals. It will be time for the opposition to either put up or shut up.